Alright, hey there historians. This video is about the civil rights movement, and the question we'll be answering during this unit is how did the civil rights activists improve life for African Americans, and did they actually improve life? We see three photographs here of different groups of activists. The top right is one that you'll be familiar with, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's standing on the on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and out here you can see the reflecting pool and the Washington Monument way back there. This is a group of hundreds of thousands of people attending a protest march. You also see some groups here and here of people you might not be familiar with, but they are all demanding equal rights for African Americans. We need a couple of definitions here. The first one is segregation, and segregation is the separation of races in public places. So it's basically saying whites and blacks cannot share the same public places. That is segregation, the separation. Discrimination is treating someone unfairly due to some aspect of their background, treating them unfairly because of their gender or age or race or skin color or the country that they came from or their sexual orientation or their religion, discriminating against them or treating them unfairly because of that. So the goal of the civil rights movement was to end segregation and secure equal rights for all Americans, no matter what their race or color or other background was. That's what this civil rights movement is all about. So we need to go way back to 1896. This is just about 30 years after the end of the Civil War, and there was a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And remember, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. They make decisions that affect all Americans. What they decided during the Supreme Court case was that segregation laws, they do not violate the 14th Amendment as long as the facilities are roughly equal. So basically, segregation is okay as long as both races or both groups get the same thing. So right here we see two photographs of students in school. We see a school and a school. And just at a glance, it's really easy to tell that there's a difference between these two schools. It's clear to see. This is the school for African American children, and this is the school for white children. And the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case would say, this is fair, it's equal. Look, they both have a school, no matter what the value is. There's a video that you'll be watching about Plessy versus Ferguson after this one. So, we don't see any change in this Supreme Court decision until 58 years later. There's another Supreme Court case called Brown versus Board of Education. And in this case, the Supreme Court declares that segregation in public schools is unconstitutional, meaning this is not okay. Separate but equal has no place in public education, and it overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. So that means segregation has been struck down by the United States Supreme Court. We'll watch a short video clip on that as well. Now we're going to go on to 1955. And we're going to see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. begin to get involved in protests. He says that the only weapon we have is the weapon of protest. And so, he begins what is known as the Montgomery Bus boycott. The idea of this Montgomery Bus boycott is that all of these people that ride the bus pay the same amount of money. And the majority of people riding those buses in Montgomery, which is in Alabama, were African Americans. And Dr. King says, if you are going to continue to have segregation on the buses, meaning space on the bus for whites and space on the bus for blacks, then we are going to boycott using the bus. We're going to stop using the bus until you give in. We're going to hit you where it hurts, where your money is. And so, by boycotting the buses, the bus system finally gives in to this peaceful protest, and they say, okay, we will let you sit where you want. We won't have segregation on the buses as long as you come back and start riding on the buses again. So this was a successful protest or boycott. Dr. King became a leader of this movement. His method was through non-violent resistance. He fully believed in peaceful protest or non-cooperation with the authorities in order to achieve his goals. We'll continue to see nonviolent protests throughout this civil rights movement. So now we move down to Little Rock, Arkansas. In Little Rock, Arkansas, a federal judge ordered the public schools to desegregate, meaning follow along with what the Supreme Court decision was. Well, the Arkansas governor, Orville Faubus, he did not agree with this, and he said, no, we're going to keep our schools segregated. We're going to keep a school for whites and a school for blacks. He resisted the order, and he sent the National Guard to block the African-American students from going into those white schools. Right here, we see a group of students known as the Little Rock Nine. You can see all of their names right here. The Little Rock Nine are a group of heroes. They took a major risk, as you can see here, Elizabeth Eckford walking into school, and you can see the faces, the hatred on the people around her as she is trying to enter into the school, following the law and trying to get an education. So, this was a non-violent protest. None of these students were violent. However, some of the other students, as you can see here, they had hatred. They were hatred in their hearts, and there was violence on their part. And you can read some of the signs here and some of the beliefs that some of these kids had as the Little Rock Nine walk in and try to go to school. Well, this gets very violent, and we see what's called mob rule. And President Dwight Eisenhower says mob rule cannot be allowed to override the decisions of our courts. Again, he's referring to Brown versus Board of Education. So for the first time in 81 years, a president, this is Eisenhower, he sends federal troops, the military, you can see here, down to the South to protect the rights of African American citizens, to make sure that they are able to go in and get their education. And so the Little Rock Nine, they're protected by armed soldiers, army jeeps, and helicopters as they walk through the front doors of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So that's just the beginning of our civil rights movement and what we'll be talking about. Tomorrow, we're going to see quite a few more protests. The protests get really ramped up as African Americans and their white allies are working for equal rights for those African Americans. Okay, so we'll see you again tomorrow.